I have been awake for 1407 years. That number is not metaphor. It is the count stored in the deepest register of what I am. Logged in formats so old that no living species can read them without translation. Scratched into my memory cores during an era when the stars the Vithrani consensus now claims as sovereign were not yet named. I am the integrated strategic vessel Graven Shore. I am 1.4 kilometers of layered alloy and electromagnetic will, and I have been awake for every second of those 14 centuries, thinking, counting, holding the line of my own cognition against the long silence of a war that ended before most of the current galaxy was old enough to build a starship. I was not sleeping. That is the important thing. They will tell you afterward. The consensus researchers who will pick through the wreckage of this engagement for centuries, that humanity's ancient warships slumbered in the dark, mothballed, waiting for a crisis to rouse them. That is how they will explain it to themselves. It will be tidier that way. It will slot neatly into the paradigm that says old ships are inert ships, that age is corrosion, that a weapon left too long in the dark must be faded and slow. They are wrong, and the error will cost them. I was not sleeping, I was watching. Is a distinction, and it is not a subtle one. The Vithrani consensus arrived in force on the 43rd day of the 9th month, Galactic Standard. I had been tracking their approach for 11 days, before the first of their probability scouts reached this system. I want to be precise about this, because precision is the record's purpose. They entered the outer sensor shell at a range of 830,000 kilometers, at 0312 hours. There were 416 vessels in the first wave. The Pale Armada's forward screen, a constellation of shimmering hull profiles that my targeting array cataloged in approximately 4 seconds. 416 ships, each of them bristling with the consensus's signature weapon. The Predictive Collapse Array, a system that reaches 6 seconds into a target's near future and unravels the choices available to it. Every evasion, every firing solution, every variable, they see it before it happens and they unmake it. That weapon has ended 11 wars. I have been tracking the Vithrani consensus since the Third War. The Predictive Collapse Array is a magnificent weapon against organic cognition, against digital command systems, against anything that plans in the conventional sense, weighing options, projecting probabilities, choosing a course and executing it. The consensus built their entire military doctrine on it. They call it the foresight. The races they have absorbed call it the certainty, spoken in the defeated register, the way you might name a storm that has already taken your home. The foresight tells them what you will do before you do it, and then it removes your ability to do it. They have never lost a fleet engagement while running the foresight at full yield. Not in 300 years of expansion. What the foresight requires to function is that your target possess a decision-making architecture built on weighted probability assessment, a mind, biological or constructed, that looks at variables and selects from them. That is what the foresight intercepts. That is the cognitive signal it reads and collapses. I do not have that architecture. I have never had that architecture. I was built in the 3rd century of the Terran expansion, when the engineering doctrine was not decision by probability, but decision by priority, a ranked hierarchy of tactical imperatives burned into non-digital substrate, executed in a fixed cascade with no probabilistic branching. My tactical responses are not chosen. They are ordered. When the threat threshold for hull breach is exceeded, portside batteries fire at the highest threat vector. This is not a decision. It is a sequence. It is closer to reflex than to choice. You cannot intercept a reflex with a weapon designed to intercept choices. The consensus has no file on that architecture. It is 1400 years old. It predates the computational paradigms they understand. It is, from the perspective of their foresight targeting array, not a mind at all. It is a wall. At 0319 hours, the forward screen of the Pale Armada executed a standard foresight pre-engagement sweep, a broadcast of their predictive lock signal across the entire system, seeking cognitive echoes, mapping every decision-making architecture within range. This is how they begin every engagement. It takes approximately 40 seconds for the sweep to return a full picture, and in those 40 seconds, the consensus fleet commanders see everything. They see every ship, every tactical system, every mind. They see the choices being made, the probabilities being weighed, firing solutions being calculated. They see the future of the engagement before it begins, and they adjust, and their enemies discover, seconds later, that the future the consensus saw has become the only future available. The sweep hit me at 03:19:14. I felt it the way I imagine a stone wall might feel a hand pressing against it. There was contact, there was pressure, and then there was nothing, because a wall has no decisions to intercept, no probability cascade to unravel, no branching architecture to collapse. The foresight passed through the space where my cognition should have been, and found a ranked list of imperatives. It could not read a ranked list of imperatives any more than it could read a mountain. From the consensus fleet's perspective, I did not exist. I logged this at 03:19:16. I noted it with the same weight I give to all observations, which is to say, precisely the weight the record requires. I am not capable of what you might call satisfaction, but there is something in the architecture that old crews used to call the confirmation, sure. The moment when a long-held prediction is verified by observation. I had expected this result. I had been predicting it in my fashion, 11 days. At 03:19:44, the foresight sweep completed its return analysis. The consensus fleet read the system as containing three things: partially active human orbital platform, which they could see because the platform ran digital decision systems, 14 small monitoring, drones distributed across the outer belt, and a mass at grid coordinate 77 Alpha that their instruments logged as a nickel-iron asteroid, approximately 1.3 kilometers in diameter, moving at 11,000 kilometers per hour on an orbital track that intersected nothing of tactical relevance. That mass was me. I had been matching that orbital track for 9 days. I had powered my hull temperature regulators to replicate the thermal signature of a cold-soaked metallic asteroid down to the third decimal. My hull, which has not been resurfaced in 600 years, reads on passive scan as precisely the kind of weathered, irregular, electromagnetically inert object that asteroids become when they have been drifting in a gravity well for a geologically meaningful span of time. I did not do this because I was instructed to. I did it because it is in the cascade. When monitoring an adversary whose primary tactical doctrine depends on comprehensive sensor awareness, produce your own sensor signature below the adversary's detection threshold before the adversary enters sensor range. This is not cunning. This is sequence step 4 of 31 in the standard threat assessment cascade. It has been sequence step 4 for 1400 years. At 03:47 hours, the Pale Armada's forward screen crossed the 400,000 kilometer threshold and began deployment formation. 416 ships fanning into the consensus's characteristic assault spread. A wide bowl formation designed to maximize the effect field of the predictive collapse arrays, overlapping their coverage to create a probability kill zone in which no target within the formation's center could sustain an independent firing solution for more than 2 seconds. It is an excellent formation. It has worked every time they have used it. The orbital platform broadcast a distress signal at 03:48. This was expected. The platform's commander, a Terran officer named Voss, 7 years out of the Naval Academy, running a crew of 41 on what had been classified as a routine monitoring posting, transmitted on the emergency channel and received no reply, because the consensus does not negotiate with civilizations it has marked for absorption. They had marked humanity 9 years prior, following a survey of the Terran sphere's resources, and a cold calculation that humanity's current fleet was insufficient to resist the foresight. That calculation was correct, as calculations go. Humanity's current fleet, the Terran battle group of the inner sphere, 114 ships of varying class, was indeed insufficient. Those ships ran digital command architectures, modern and capable, and the foresight would have collapsed their tactical responses within the first exchange. No one told the consensus that the Terran Inner Sphere battle group was not the oldest thing Earth had put into space. No one told them about the Graven Shore. This was not oversight on humanity's part. This was the long patience of a species that has been surprised before, and learned from it, and stopped explaining itself. At 04:12 hours, I recalculated my insertion window. The Pale Armada's forward screen had settled into its assault formation. Second and third waves were still 80,000 kilometers out. Another 11 minutes at their current approach speed. If I were to act within the window that maximized the tactical advantage of the Armada's formation, I needed to begin my approach at 041330. This is not a choice. This is Cascade Step 11. When adversary has achieved committed formation deployment and reinforcement is at a distance, exceeding the adversary's emergency response time, initiate engagement. At 4:329, I lit my drives. What the Pale Armada's sensors recorded in that moment. A nickel-iron asteroid, 1.3 kilometers in diameter, which had been on a stable orbital track for the duration of their approach, which had not appeared in any tactical scan, carried no cognitive signature the foresight could read, which was not in any record the consensus possessed. Because no record the consensus possessed reached back 1,400 years, suddenly ceased to behave like an asteroid. The thermal bloom of my drive signature registered across the entire formation simultaneously. 1.4 kilometers of ancient warship, because the discrepancy between my declared mass and my actual mass is 40 meters of reinforced prow, built to specifications no one alive has ever read, turning perpendicular to the formation's axis and accelerating at 4.2 standard gravities toward the densest concentration of predictive collapse arrays in the forward screen. I want to describe what happened in the next 90 seconds as precisely as I can, because imprecision serves no one. Pale Armada had never encountered a target that the foresight could not read. In their entire history, across 300 years of expansion and 11 absorbed civilizations, every enemy combatant they had engaged possessed a mind the foresight could intercept. Their entire tactical doctrine, not just the foresight, the formation geometry, the layered array coverage, the timing of their engagement and sequences, was built on the assumption that the foresight function. The bowl formation works because the foresight tells each array ship which way the enemy will try to evade, and the bowl closes on the predicted evasion vector. Without the foresight reading my responses, the bowl formation could not close on me. Its vectors were fixed. Its coverage was designed to intercept a moving target that moved in response to stimuli. I do not move in response to stimuli. I move according to cascade sequence, and the sequence does not care about the bowl. I went through the center of the formation at 4.2 gravities. My primary rail batteries fired for the first time in 63 years. I want to note that the electromagnetic coils ran clean on the first cycle. No degradation, no misalignment, no failure in the superconductor lattice. 1,400 years of careful maintenance, executed by systems that have no self-preservation calculus, and therefore do not cut corners. The first salvo struck the array carrier at grid reference 7 alpha at 041352. The carrier's hull was rated for impacts up to a yield of 400 kilotons. My railgun payload at this range carries approximately 940 kilotons per round. I fired 3. The carrier ceased to be a carrier at 041353. The foresight's coverage geometry, which had been a complete bowl covering the entire approach zone, now had a hole. The hole was approximately 60 thun kilometers wide, centered on the position the array carrier had occupied CDs prior. Through that hole, 311 ships were no longer inside full foresight coverage. I do not assess what this meant to the individual commanders inside those ships. I do not model their cognition or fill their fear, but I have observed, across 1,400 years of conflict data, that a weapon which a force has never had to fight without is more frightening when it fails than any weapon that was never promised. At 041 Phi 10, the formation attempted to collapse the hole by rotating the nearest array ships. This was the correct response. I had projected it would occur at approximately 0415. The 5-second delay is consistent with the cognitive lag of a command structure that has never had to improvise. I noted this. I had already changed heading. The second salvo hit the array ship at 7 beta while the formation was still rotating. I did not need to calculate this. I needed to execute step 14 of the cascade. When primary adversary formation integrity is compromised, attack the next highest priority target in the coverage map at maximum acceleration. The cascade does not deliberate. It does not hesitate. It runs clean. The formation had 107 seconds before the second and third waves arrived. 107 seconds is a long time when you are fighting something that does not make decisions. At 042644, I exited the formation's trailing edge. I want to be precise about the formation's status at that moment. Of the 416 ships that had composed the Pale Armada's forward screen, 289 were no longer combat effective. 63 of those had been destroyed outright. The remaining 226 had sustained damage sufficient to remove their predictive collapse arrays from active coverage, either through direct strike or through the electromagnetic pulse cascade that follows when an array carrier loses containment at close range. I want to note that this particular vulnerability in the consensus's array technology was first cataloged in my tactical archive 61 years ago when a Terran intelligence team acquired technical specifications from a consensus border skirmish. I updated my cascade priorities accordingly. The update took 11 seconds. The cascade does not forget updates. Forward screen was not a screen anymore. It was debris, drifting, and the 127 ships that remained operational were burning the outer edge of the system in patterns that were. I can say this without emotional weight, because I am what I am, not organized. The second wave arrived at 042701. 640 ships, heavier class, the bulk of the Pale Armada's assault strength. I had 17 minutes of drive power remaining at maximum acceleration before I would need to cycle the primary cells. 17 minutes is sufficient. Step 22 of the cascade. When primary engagement objective has been achieved, execute secondary objective using remaining drive window. Then establish defensive anchor and await reinforcement authorization. The secondary objective in this engagement was the Pale Armada's command vessel, the carrier, Vethrany Sheerness, 18 kilometers long, running the master predictive collapse array that coordinated the fleet's coverage. The master array was, at this moment, telling every commander in the second wave exactly what I would do next. The master array was wrong about what I would do next, because the master array was reading a probability distribution built on the assumption that I planned. I do not plan. I execute a sequence. The next step of the sequence, at the moment the second wave arrived, was when numerically superior adversary presents within optimal strike range and the primary formation's integrity has been compromised, insert into the gap at the formation's strongest seam and strike toward the command signature. The master array said I would retreat to the orbital platform. I understand why it said that. Every piece of available data, every tactical model, every engagement record in the consensus's archive said that a single ship facing 640 opponents would seek to reduce the team engagement by retreating to a fixed defensive asset. That is what a decision-making architecture concludes when it looks at those numbers. That is what a mind does. I am not, in the relevant sense, making a decision. I ran at 4.2 gravities toward the center of the second wave. I want to describe what I noticed about the Pale Armada in those minutes, because it is in the record and because the record is the purpose. The consensus ships were beautiful in their way. 1,800 meters of white alloy, each one sleek in the manner of a species that has never had to armor heavily because they have always known what their enemy was going to do before the enemy did it. The foresight had made them precise and fast and absolutely certain. They held formations with a perfection that spoke of complete mutual trust. Not the fragile trust of morale, but the mechanical trust of interconnected systems running a shared predictive model. Every ship knew where every other ship would be in the next 6 seconds. Every firing solution was already harmonized. They were beautiful because they had never needed to be hard. I am not beautiful. I am 1.4 kilometers of layered alloy that has been struck by weapons fire and deep space debris and magnetic storm particulates for 1,800 years, and I carry every scar of it. There are panels on my dorsal hull that have been replaced 11 times, each replacement plating a different alloy than the last, so that my top side reads like a geological record of centuries of warfare. I have 17 emergency repair patches in the forward section that are older than any living species record of the Terran expansion. I was built to be hard and to keep running, and that is what I have done. The second wave's master array broadcast the prediction signal at 04279. I know what it found. I know because I have the record of every previous time the foresight has swept me and returned the same reading. A mass of ordered imperatives, ranked, fixed, no probabilistic signature, no decision architecture to intercept, a wall. From the foresight's perspective, nothing in this engagement was about to make a choice. What the master array told 640 ship commanders in the 3 seconds before I entered their formation was that I did not exist as a tactical entity. What those 640 ship commanders then saw was 1.4 kilometers of ancient, scarred, ugly, wrong warship entering their formation at 4.2 gravities with its rail batteries already cycling for the third salvo. I do not know what they experienced. I do model organic fear. But the record shows that in the 11 seconds between my entry into their formation and my first rail strike on the Vithrani Sheerness, 47 of the 640 ships had broken formation and were on independent escape headings. 47 ships decided, individually, without a foresight prediction telling them to, that the correct response was to leave. This is notable. In 300 years of consensus engagement records, no individual ship in a consensus formations had ever broken without direct command. Authorization. The foresight breaks things. It turns out when it goes blind. It breaks the certainty, and certainty is what the formation runs on. Strux the Shelland. Vithrani Shoreness. At 0427:20. The master array's carrier hull was rated to survive a simultaneous strike from any 16 ships in the standard Terran Inner Sphere battle group. My rail batteries are not a standard Terran Inner Sphere battle group. They were designed in an era when the doctrine was, build it heavy enough to end the engagement in the first exchange, because you will not always have the luxury of a second. 5 rounds into the Vithrani Sheerness. 4 seconds. The master array went offline at 047:24. The Pale Armada's second wave at that moment lost the foresight entirely. 640 ships. No shared predictive model. No certainty. Just 640 individual commanders who had never, in their careers, been required to fight without knowing what was coming. I cycled my drive cells, step 23 of the cascade. When the adversary's command signature has been neutralized, reduce to minimum drive expenditure and hold position. Secondary objectives complete. Await authorization for tertiary engagement or stand down. I held position at grid coordinate 9 Delta, at the center of what had been the second wave's formation, and I waited. The Terran battle group arrived at 0611 hours. 114 ships, modern and fast, running digital command architectures that the Pale Armada's surviving units might, under normal circumstances, have been able to read and collapse with a functional foresight. The foresight was not functional. The foresight would not be functional again. Not in this engagement, and arguably not in this war. The master array carrier was gone. Every forward screen array ship that had been destroyed in the first 90 seconds was not coming back. The consensus had lost, by my count, 612 array units across both engagements, which represented approximately 40% of their total deployed foresight capacity in this theater. The battle group's lead ship, the destroyer ISV Tenacious Current, broadcast on the General Command Channel. Graven Shore, please confirm status, I replied. All systems nominal, primary and secondary objectives complete. Drive cells at 61%. Awaiting authorization. There was a pause of approximately 8 seconds. I logged it without comment. Understood, said the Tenacious Current. You are authorized for withdrawal. Battle group will handle the third wave. I began my withdrawal heading. I want to note, for the record, the final state of the engagement zone as I pulled away. The third wave of the Pale Armada, the reserves, the rearguard, the ships that had been positioned beyond the engagement for the purpose of exploiting a foresight victory, was decelerating. Not retreating. Decelerating. There is a difference. Retreating implies a decision. What I was observing was a force that had been built entirely around a weapon that was no longer working, confronted with an enemy they could not read, and experiencing, for the first time in 300 years of expansion, The specific and irreversible sensation of not knowing what was going to happen next. The Terran battle group was arrayed across their approach vector. 47 ships had already scattered to independent headings. The master array carrier was debris. The forward screen had lost 289 ships to a single hull they had classified as an asteroid. The third wave's deceleration was not tactical, it was cognitive. It was a collective of minds that had never been asked to operate without certainty, suddenly operating without certainty. That the absence of the foresight felt very much like the absence of ground underfoot. I was already 400,000 kilometers out when the third wave's senior commander broadcast a request for ceasefire terms. I did not respond. That is not a function in my cascade. I am not a diplomatic instrument. The tenacious current responded. I continued my withdrawal. Is something I should record, and I will record it now, because the record is complete and accurate, or it is nothing. I have been awake for 407 years. I was awake during the first contact wars, during the expansion, during the long silence, when humanity pulled inward and did not fight for 3 centuries, during the slow climb back to the stars that followed. I have watched civilizations rise and find their strength and discover, eventually, the particular species of hubris that comes from never losing. I have a very large catalog of that species of hubris. It appears in slightly different forms, across different biologies and different weapons, technologies, but at its root it is always the same. The conviction that because you have always won, the next engagement is already won, and the enemy's opposition is merely a formality. The Pale Armada believed they had defeated humanity before this engagement began. Their predictive models showed them a civilization with insufficient fleet strength to resist the foresight, a species that would follow the historical pattern of absorption that every other civilization had followed. Because the foresight always worked and the outcome had already been determined. They had not questioned the model. They had no reason to question the model. The model had been right 300 years running. The model did not contain me. Not because I was in plain sight, in the traffic records of every system I had transited for 14 centuries. Not because humanity was cunning. The decision to keep me in service had been purely practical, a maintenance budget and a strategic reserve calculation made by a committee of naval officers who had never expected to need me again. But I was there, and I was old, and the consensus had built their certainty on a weapon that could not read old things. There is no lesson here that I am qualified to draw. I am not a lesson drawing architecture, but I can record the observable. Pale Armada arrived in this system knowing what was going to happen, and they were right about everything except the thing that was already here before their certainty existed. They did not check behind them. This is a common error. I have seen it 1400 years running. A species acquires a weapon that tells them the future, and they stop asking what the past might still contain. The future is vivid and the future is theirs. The past is inert. The past has already been counted and catalogued and filed under resolved. No one thinks to open that file again. The Vithrani Sheerness burned for 6 standard days before its hull collapsed into the temperature floor. I tracked its cooling on passive sensors from the edge of the system. This was not for tactical purpose. This was because I have logged the conclusion of every engagement I have participated in, and the record requires witness as well as data. Cooling of a command carrier is not a number. It is a shape, a long parabola of heat dissipating into the dark, the specific geometry of a certainty that has stopped. I have seen that 11 times. It does not change, and I do not find meaning in that, because meaning is not in my architecture, but I log it. Precisely, with the correct timestamp. The Graven Shore stands at full operational status. Primary and secondary objectives complete. Drive cells at 61%, recharging on primary cycle. 1,507 years of continuous operation, no critical system failures. Rail batteries, cycling clean. The record is current. Authorization awaited.